When Ethan Cole's truck headlights caught the twisted metal in the blizzard, he had 3 seconds to make a choice that would destroy everything he knew about survival. Inside that overturned SUV, a woman was dying. His daughter was home alone, 20 miles away, waiting. The storm was swallowing the mountain. His truck had maybe 1 trip left in it. Save a stranger and risk orphaning his child, or drive away and live with what he'd left behind. He stepped into the snow. 6 minutes of CPR, a lifetime of consequences. Some nights don't give you good options, only the ones you can live with. If you're watching from anywhere in the world, drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. And if it moves you, hit that like button. Let's build this community together. The windshield wipers were losing. Ethan Cole hunched forward, his calloused hands gripping the steering wheel like it was the only solid thing left in a world turning liquid with snow. The defroster wheezed asthmatic heat against the ice forming on the inside of the glass. Outside, Colorado's Route 149 had stopped being a road 30 minutes ago. Now it was just a theory, a place where asphalt used to be, buried under 2 feet of powder that the wind kept reshaping into something that wanted to kill you. His phone sat dead in the cup holder. The battery had given up an hour back, right after the last text from Mrs. Chen confirming she'd stay with Sophie until he got home. That was before the storm had upgraded from severe to biblical, before the highway patrol had probably closed the pass, before Ethan had committed to the stupidest decision of his life, pushing through instead of turning back. But turning back meant another night away from his daughter, another broken promise. Another time Sophie would fall asleep wondering if Daddy was okay, her small face pressed against Mrs. Chen's guest room window, watching for headlights that wouldn't come. So Ethan had pointed his 15-year-old Ford F-150 toward home and driven straight into the teeth of the storm. The truck groaned as he guided it through another drift, the engine note changing from confident to questioning. The temperature gauge was climbing, had been for the last 10 miles. Something in the cooling system was giving up. He could smell it now, that sweet, sick antifreeze scent bleeding through the vents. "Come on, baby," he muttered, patting the dashboard like it was a spooked horse. "Just 20 more miles. We've done harder." The truck responded with a shudder that felt like disagreement. Ethan's eyes ached from staring into the hypnotic swirl of white. The headlights carved out maybe 15 feet of visibility before the snow ate everything. No other cars. No lights from houses tucked into the forest. Just the dark and the cold and the wind that hit the truck in waves, trying to shove it toward the guardrail that was supposed to be somewhere to his right. He'd left the job site in Crete at 4:30, figuring he'd beat the worst of it. The reconstruction project had run over, a bathroom renovation in one of those vacation mansions that people from Denver bought and visited twice a year. The client had insisted on imported tile from Italy, which meant Ethan had spent 3 extra days wrestling with pieces that cost more per square foot than his mortgage payment. But the work paid. The work always paid, because Ethan couldn't afford for it not to. Single father, small business owner. The guy who'd inherited Cole and Son construction when his father died, back when and Son still meant something because there'd been a wife and a future and plans. Before the cancer had taken Rebecca. Before the world had narrowed down to just him and Sophie against everything else. The truck fishtailed, back end sliding left. Ethan corrected without thinking, muscle memory from a lifetime of mountain winters. The tires found purchase. The truck straightened, and then he saw it. At first, his brain refused to process what the headlights had caught. A shape. Wrong geometry. Too angular for a snowbank, too dark for a boulder. Ethan's foot moved to the brake instinctively, and the truck slowed with a grinding reluctance that said the brakes were starting to ice up too. He leaned forward until his nose almost touched the windshield. There, 30 feet ahead, half buried in the snow that had drifted against the mountainside, was a vehicle. No, not just a vehicle. An expensive one. A luxury SUV, one of those German tanks that cost more than Ethan made in a year, and it was upside down. The roof was crumpled into the snow. The undercarriage pointed at the sky. The wheels were still. No headlights. No flashers. No movement. Ethan stopped the truck. For 5 full seconds, he sat there, engine running, wipers squeaking, heart hammering against his ribs. His hands didn't leave the wheel. His eyes didn't leave the wreck. The practical part of his brain, the part that had kept him and Sophie alive for the last 3 years, started talking fast and loud. Keep driving. You call it in when you get service. Highway patrol handles this. You have a daughter at home. You have a truck that's dying. You have maybe 1 trip left in this machine, and if you use it stopping here, you might not make it home at all. Sophie needs you. The stranger in that SUV is probably already dead. You can't save everyone. You can't even save yourself most days. Ethan's hands tightened on the wheel. Then he thought about Sophie finding out, years from now, learning that Daddy had driven past someone who needed help because he was scared. Learning that the man who'd raised her to be kind, to be brave, to do the right thing even when it cost, that man had chosen fear when it mattered most. God damn it, Ethan whispered. He put the truck in park, killed the engine, and stepped out into the storm. The cold hit him like a fist. Not cold, that was too small a word. This was the kind of cold that had teeth. It went straight through his work jacket, his flannel, his thermal undershirt, and set up shop in his bones. The wind screamed in his ears. The snow came at him sideways, sharp little crystals that stung exposed skin. Ethan pulled his hood up and started toward the SUV. Each step sank him knee-deep. The snow had that heavy, wet quality that made every movement expensive. He could feel his jeans soaking through, ice water seeping into his work boots. The temperature was maybe 10 degrees, probably lower with the wind chill. He had minutes out here before hypothermia started making decisions for him. The SUV was worse up close. The whole driver's side was accordioned in where it had hit something, probably a tree, before rolling. The roof had compressed almost flat. The windows were spiderwebbed with cracks, some blown out entirely, spilling safety glass across the snow. No tracks leading away. No footprints. Whoever had been driving hadn't walked away from this. Ethan circled to what was left of the windshield, dropped to his knees in the snow, and peered inside. It took his eyes a moment to adjust, to separate the shadows from the wreckage, the objects from the emptiness. Then he saw her. A woman. Hanging upside down, held by her seatbelt, dark hair obscuring her face, arms dangling toward the crumpled roof, not moving. Snow had blown in through the shattered windows, dusting her like a burial shroud. "Hey!" Ethan shouted, his voice barely carrying over the wind. "Can you hear me?" Nothing. He reached through the broken window, sharp edges of glass scraping his jacket, and touched her neck with 2 fingers. The skin was cold. Too cold. But under his fingertips, there. Faint. A pulse. Alive. "Okay," Ethan said, talking to himself, to her, to the storm. "Okay. You're alive. We're going to keep it that way." He assessed the situation with the quick, methodical eye of someone who'd spent 20 years in construction. The seatbelt was jammed. The door was crushed shut. The windshield was the only way in, and barely that. The roof had collapsed to within inches of the dashboard. Ethan crawled back to his truck, moving fast despite the snow dragging at him. His toolbox was behind the seat. He grabbed his pry bar, his work gloves, a folded emergency blanket that Rebecca had insisted he keep in the truck years ago. The work gloves wouldn't do much against the cold, but they'd keep his hands functional a little longer. Back at the SUV, Ethan used the pry bar to clear the remaining windshield glass, knocking it inward carefully, trying not to rain it down on the woman. Then he squeezed through the opening, sharp metal scraping his shoulders, snow falling into his collar. Inside was a tomb of twisted luxury, leather seats torn, dashboard lit up with a constellation of air lights draining a battery that wouldn't last much longer. The smell of gasoline and antifreeze and something else. Blood. The woman had a gash across her forehead, already clotted, the blood frozen in dark rivulets down her temple. Her breathing was shallow. Her lips had a blue tinge that Ethan knew meant her core temperature was dropping fast. He pulled out his work knife and cut the seatbelt. She dropped into his arms, dead weight, her head lolling against his chest. Light, too light. Under the expensive wool coat and designer clothes, she was all sharp angles and fragility. Getting her out through the windshield was brutal. Ethan had to push her through first, trying to support her head, trying not to let her bang against the jagged edges of the frame. Then he had to crawl out himself, grab her under the arms, and drag her away from the wreck. He pulled her 30 feet before he had to stop, his lungs screaming, his legs shaking. The wind tried to knock them both over. The snow kept coming. Ethan looked back at his truck, a distant shape in the white, headlights still on, looking like the last light in a dying universe. He looked down at the woman. Her eyes were closed. Her breathing was getting slower. She was dying. And Ethan's truck was dying, and the storm was going to kill them both if he didn't move right now. He tried to lift her in his arms, collapsed under her weight, his legs giving out, too tired, too cold. He grabbed her under the shoulders instead and dragged her step by agonizing step toward the truck. 20 feet, 15, 10. His vision was starting to tunnel. His hands were numb inside the gloves. His thoughts were getting slow, sticky, confused. 5 feet. He got her to the passenger side, wrenched the door open, shoved her inside. Her head hit the door frame and he winced but couldn't stop, couldn't be gentle, could only get her in and close the door before the heat escaped. Ethan staggered around to the driver's side and fell into the seat. Slammed the door, cranked the heat to maximum. The engine was still running, had been running the whole time, and that stupid decision might have just saved both their lives because the cab was warm, gloriously warm. He sat there for 30 seconds, shaking, breathing hard, watching the woman slumped in the passenger seat. Her chest rose and fell. Still alive. Ethan reached over, careful now, and positioned her so she wouldn't slide onto the floor. He wrapped the emergency blanket around her shoulders. It crinkled loud in the cab, that metallic survival gear sound. Then he put the truck in gear and started driving. Except driving wasn't the right word anymore. Crawling, hoping, praying. The truck lurched forward through snow that was getting deeper by the minute. The temperature gauge was buried in the red now. The engine was making a sound like grinding teeth, but it was moving, still moving. Ethan's mind raced. He was 12 miles from home. 12 miles in conditions that were getting worse, with a truck that had maybe 5 miles left in it, and a woman who needed a hospital immediately. He grabbed his phone from the cup holder, still dead. The woman might have one. He reached over, patted her coat pockets, found it. Expensive. Locked. Face ID. He tried to angle it toward her face, but her eyes were closed and the screen just said Face ID not recognized over and over. No phone, no help, no options. Ethan kept driving. 3 miles later, the truck died. Not dramatically, no explosion or grinding halt. The engine just coughed once, twice, and went quiet. The headlights dimmed to orange and faded. The heat stopped. Ethan tried to restart it. The starter clicked empty. Dead battery, dead alternator, dead everything. They were sitting in a metal box that would become a freezer in about 10 minutes. Ethan looked at the woman. Her breathing was even shallower now. Her skin had gone from pale to gray. She needed warmth. She needed medical attention. She needed things Ethan couldn't give her in a dead truck on a closed highway in the middle of a blizzard. He looked out the windshield, nothing but white and dark. No houses, no lights. Wait. Ethan squinted, leaning forward. There, maybe 100 yards off the road, back in the trees. A shape. A darker shadow against the dark. The old Keller hunting cabin. Ethan had forgotten about it. The family who owned it had stopped using it years ago, but the structure was solid. His father had helped build it back in the 80s. It would have a fireplace, walls, a door that closed. It wouldn't be warm, but it would be better than a dead truck. He looked at the woman again, then at the cabin, then back at the woman. You better be worth this, he muttered, and opened the door. The cold slammed into him worse than before. His body had gotten used to the warmth of the cab, and now stepping back into the storm felt like stepping into a meat locker. Ethan went around to the passenger side, opened the door, and pulled the woman out. She was limp, completely unconscious. He tried to lift her in his arms again, made it 3 steps before his knees buckled. The snow was too deep. His legs were too tired. He was going to drop her. So he did what he had to do. He grabbed her under the arms, her back against his chest, and started dragging her backward toward the trees. It was the longest 100 yards of Ethan's life. The snow tried to bury them. The wind tried to knock them down. His boots lost traction and he fell twice, both times keeping his grip on her, both times struggling back to his feet with legs that felt like they belonged to someone else. The trees helped once he reached them. The wind wasn't as vicious under the pines. But the snow was deeper, untouched powder that swallowed his legs to mid-thigh. He couldn't see the cabin anymore. He was navigating on memory and hope, pulling a dying woman through a forest in the dark, his own body starting to shut down from cold and exhaustion. His father's voice came to him, clear as if the old man was standing right there. You stop moving in a storm like this, you die. Simple as that. So don't stop. Ethan didn't stop. And then the cabin was in front of him, a small structure barely bigger than a one-car garage, windows dark, door hanging slightly crooked. Beautiful. Ethan dragged the woman up the 2 steps to the porch, propped her against the wall, and tried the door. Locked. He kicked it. The old wood splintered around the latch, and the door swung inward. Dark inside. Cold. But no wind. No snow. Ethan pulled the woman inside and closed the door behind them. He stood there in the blackness, breathing hard, his breath steaming in front of his face. His hands were numb. His feet were numb. His face felt like frozen meat. But they were inside. Out of the wind. Out of the storm. Ethan's eyes adjusted slowly. The cabin was one room, maybe 20 feet square. An old stone fireplace dominated one wall, a cot with a bare mattress against another, a small table, 2 chairs, dust everywhere. But the roof looked intact. The windows were whole. His hands were shaking too hard to use them properly, but he managed to drag the woman over to the cot and lay her down. The emergency blanket was still wrapped around her, but it wasn't enough. He needed heat. Fire. Ethan stumbled to the fireplace. Please let there be wood. Please. There was. A stack of old logs against the wall, dusty but dry. Someone had left them years ago, kindling in a metal bucket. Matches in a jar on the mantel. His hands were so numb, he dropped the matches twice before he got the jar open. He built the fire on pure muscle memory, kindling first, then the smaller logs, everything arranged to let air flow. He struck a match. It broke. Struck another. It lit. He held it to the kindling and whispered, "Come on, please." The fire caught. Small at first, reluctant, then growing, finding the wood, spreading, crackling to life. Heat began to radiate out in waves, actual, miraculous heat. Ethan fed it more wood, building it up, getting it strong. Then he turned back to the woman. She was shaking now. Not awake, but shaking, violent tremors that rattled the cot. Her lips were blue, her skin was gray. The firelight made her look like a corpse. Ethan knew enough about hypothermia to know that shaking was good. It meant her body was still trying to fight, but the shaking was getting weaker, slower. That meant she was losing. He grabbed the dusty blankets he found in a chest by the wall, old wool things that smelled like mothballs and cedar, and piled them on top of her. Then he knelt by the cot and felt for her pulse again. Faint, too faint, irregular. "Stay with me," he said. "Come on. You didn't survive that crash just to die in here." Her eyes didn't open. Her breathing got shallower. Ethan rubbed her arms through the blankets, trying to stimulate circulation. He took off her wet coat, her wet shoes. Her clothes underneath were damp with melted snow. He needed to get her into dry things, but he didn't have dry things. Everything was wet. Everything was cold. The fire was roaring now, throwing real heat. Ethan fed it more wood. Then he went back to the woman and checked her pulse again. It was weaker. No. He felt her neck, her wrist, her chest. Nothing. "No," Ethan said out loud. "No, no, no." He ripped the blankets back, put his ear to her chest. No heartbeat. She wasn't breathing. The woman he'd dragged a quarter-mile through a blizzard, the woman he'd maybe doomed his daughter for by stopping, she was dying right now, right in front of him, and Ethan's brain went blank with panic. Then his training kicked in. He'd gotten his CPR certification when Sophie was born. Rebecca had insisted. Every parent should know it, she'd said. They'd sat through the class together, practiced on dummies, joked about hoping they'd never need it. Ethan needed it now. He positioned the woman flat on the cot, tilted her head back to open her airway, and started chest compressions. 1, 2, 3, 4. Hard and fast, at least 2 inches deep. Don't stop. 10, 11, 12. His arms were already tired. His whole body was already tired. But he kept going. 28, 29, 30. He gave her 2 rescue breaths, watching her chest rise. Then back to compressions. 1, 2, 3. Come on, he grunted between compressions. Come on, damn it. 30 more. 2 more breaths. Nothing. Again. 30 and 2. The cot creaked under the force of the compressions. The fire crackled. Outside, the wind howled. Ethan counted cycles. 5, 6, 7. His arms were shaking. Sweat was running down his face despite the cold. His shoulders screamed. 8, 9, 10. Nothing. She was gone. He was compressing a corpse. 11, 12. Sophie's face flashed in his mind. His daughter, waiting at home. What if this was all for nothing? What if he'd risked everything for a stranger who was already dead? 13, 14. Don't stop. You stop. She's definitely dead. Keep going. 15. His vision was blurring. His arms felt like rubber. 16. Ethan was crying now, he realized. Tears running down his face, his breath coming in sobs. Please, he gasped. Please don't be dead. Please. 17. 18. He felt her chest move under his hands, not from his compressions, but on its own. A cough. Then another. Ethan stopped, pulled back. The woman's eyes stayed closed, but her chest rose. Fell. Rose again. Her mouth opened and she sucked in a ragged breath. Ethan felt for her pulse. There. Faint? But there. Irregular, but beating. Oh, thank God, he whispered, and collapsed onto the floor beside the cot, shaking, gasping, his whole body vibrating with adrenaline and exhaustion. Thank God. The woman coughed again, her body curling slightly. Still unconscious, but alive. Breathing. Ethan sat there on the cold cabin floor for 2 full minutes, just breathing, his heart hammering, his mind blank except for one thought repeating over and over. She's alive, she's alive, she's alive. Finally, he dragged himself to his feet and checked her again. Pulse was steadier now. Breathing was deeper. The shaking had stopped. Not because she was worse, but because the fire was actually warming the cabin, driving back the death cold that had tried to claim her. Ethan piled the blankets back on her, tucked them in tight. Then he added more wood to the fire, building it up, making the cabin as warm as he could. Only then did he let himself think about his own situation. He was soaked. His jeans were frozen stiff. His jacket was crusted with ice. His boots were full of melted snow. His hands were raw, the skin cracked and bleeding in places. His body was shaking, not from cold now, but from shock, from exhaustion, from the adrenaline crash. Ethan stripped off his wet jacket, his wet flannel, hung them by the fire. His thermal undershirt was damp but not soaked. He kept it on. He found an old tarp in the corner and wrapped it around his shoulders. Then he sat down on the floor in front of the fire and just stared at the flames. Outside, the storm raged on. Inside, 2 people who shouldn't be alive sat in a hunting cabin that shouldn't have been there, kept breathing by a fire that had almost not caught. Ethan thought about Sophie, about Mrs. Chen probably calling the police by now, reporting him missing, about search and rescue not being able to do anything until the storm passed. He thought about his truck, dead on the highway, probably buried in snow by now. He thought about the woman on the cot, who he'd brought back from actual death, who he didn't know, who he'd saved for reasons he couldn't quite explain even to himself. And he thought about the choice he'd made back on that highway. Stop or drive. Save or survive. He'd chosen to stop. And now he was here, in a cabin with a stranger, while his daughter was home wondering if Daddy was okay. Some nights don't give you good options, he thought. Only the ones you can live with. Ethan fed the fire and waited for morning. Well, 2 hours passed. Maybe 3. Ethan had lost track of time. He'd lost track of everything except keeping the fire going and checking the woman's pulse every 15 minutes. She was stable now. Her color had improved from corpse gray to just pale. Her breathing was regular. But she hadn't woken up. Hadn't moved except for the occasional twitch or murmur that might have been dreams, or might have been her brain trying to sort out the trauma of almost dying. Ethan had searched her pockets more thoroughly once she was stable. No wallet, no ID, but he'd found a set of car keys with a German luxury brand logo and a phone he couldn't unlock. He'd tried to press her finger to it, but the phone was as dead as his own now. Battery drained. So he didn't know who she was, didn't know where she'd been going or where she'd come from, didn't know if anyone was looking for her or if she'd been alone on that highway. All he knew was that she was expensive. The coat was cashmere, the kind that cost 4 figures. The boots were designer leather. The watch on her wrist, Ethan didn't know watches, but he knew craftsmanship, and that piece had been made by someone who gave a damn. Money. She had money, which meant she probably had people, which meant someone was definitely looking for her, but looking wouldn't help until the storm passed. Ethan checked the window, still white, still howling. The blizzard showed no signs of stopping. He added wood to the fire, then sat back down and let his head fall against the wall. He must have dozed off, because the next thing he knew, there was a sound, a groan, low and confused. Ethan's eyes snapped open. The woman on the cot was moving. Her hand came up to her head, touched the gash on her forehead, and she made a small sound of pain. Then her eyes opened. She stared at the ceiling for a long moment, not moving, her expression blank. Then her head turned slowly, taking in the cabin, the fire, and finally landing on Ethan. They looked at each other in silence. Her eyes were dark, sharp. Even confused and concussed, there was an intelligence there, an intensity. Where? Her voice came out as a croak. She tried again. Where am I? Hunting cabin, Ethan said. His own voice sounded rough, unused. About 12 miles outside of South Fork. You crashed your car. She blinked, processed. Her hand went to her head again, felt the dried blood. I don't remember. You were upside down in your SUV in the middle of a blizzard, Ethan said. I pulled you out, brought you here. You've been unconscious for about 3 hours. The woman stared at him, then at the cabin, then back at him. You saved me. It wasn't a question, but Ethan nodded anyway. She was quiet for a moment, her eyes moving over him, taking in his wet clothes by the fire, his undershirt, the tarp around his shoulders, the exhaustion written all over his face. Thank you, she said quietly. Ethan just nodded again. He didn't know what to say to that. You're welcome? Don't mention it? It almost killed both of us? What's your name? She asked. Ethan. Ethan Cole. I'm Claire. She paused, and something flickered across her face. Calculation, maybe, or decision. Claire Vaughn. The name hit Ethan like cold water. Claire Vaughn. He knew that name. Everyone in the county knew that name. Vaughn Development Group. The company that had spent the last 5 years buying up property in the valley, tearing down old buildings, putting up luxury condos and resort complexes. The company that had tried to buy Cole & Son Construction 2 years ago, tried to force the sale actually, with lowball offers and veiled threats about permits and contracts drying up if Ethan didn't sell. The company Ethan had told to go to hell. And now the CEO of that company was lying on a cot in an abandoned cabin because Ethan had stopped to save her life. The universe had one hell of a sense of humor. Claire was watching him, and something in his expression must have given him away because her eyes narrowed slightly. You know who I am. Yeah, Ethan said. I know who you are. Silence stretched between them, heavy and complicated. I should have left you in the car, Ethan said, and he meant it as a joke, but it came out flat, bitter. Claire's expression didn't change. But you didn't. No, Ethan agreed. I didn't. More silence. The fire crackled. The wind screamed outside. Your company tried to take my business, Ethan said, because apparently they were doing this now. 2 years ago. You offered me a third of what it was worth and told me if I didn't sell, you'd make sure I didn't get any more contracts in the valley. Claire closed her eyes briefly. I remember. Do you? Cole & Son Construction. Small firm. You refused to sell. We moved on. You moved on, Ethan repeated. My contracts dried up for 6 months. I almost lost everything. But you didn't, Claire said, echoing his own words back at him. Ethan laughed, a sharp, humorless sound. No, I didn't. I survived, like I always do. Claire shifted on the cot, wincing as the movement pulled at injuries Ethan couldn't see. She was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke again, her voice was different, softer, maybe, or just more tired. "Why did you stop?" she asked. "If you know who I am, if you know what my company did, why did you pull me out of that car?" Ethan looked at her, really looked at her. She was pale, hurt, vulnerable in a way he suspected Claire Vaughn was never vulnerable. And she was asking him a question he'd been asking himself since the moment he'd stepped out of his truck. "I don't know," he admitted. "I guess I'm an idiot." "That's not an answer." "It's the only one I've got." Claire held his gaze for another moment, then looked away, her eyes moving to the fire. "Where's your phone?" she asked. "Dead. Yours too." "My car?" "Half a mile back, buried in snow by now, and my truck died 3 miles from your crash site." She processed this. "So we're trapped here?" "Until the storm passes." "Yeah." "How long?" "Could be hours, could be a day. Hard to say." Claire closed her eyes again, and for a second Ethan thought she was going to pass out again. But then she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I was heading to Denver. Board meeting tomorrow morning, or today morning." "What time is it?" Ethan checked his watch. Dead too. "No idea. Late. Early. Does it matter?" "I suppose not." She was quiet for a while after that, and Ethan thought maybe she'd fallen asleep. But then she spoke again. "Your daughter," she said. Ethan's head snapped toward her. "What?" "You mentioned a daughter. When you were doing CPR, you were talking. You said something about your daughter needing you to not fail." Ethan's chest tightened. He didn't remember saying that. Didn't remember saying anything except "please" and "don't die" over and over. "She's 6, he said quietly. "Sophie, she's waiting for me to come home." Claire opened her eyes and looked at him. "And instead you're here because you stopped for me." It wasn't an accusation. It was just a statement of fact. But it hit Ethan harder than any accusation could have. "Yeah," he said. "I am." "I'm sorry." Ethan looked at her, surprised. "For your daughter," Claire clarified. "For making her worry, and for before, 2 years ago. The way my company handled your business. I'm sorry for that too." Ethan didn't know what to say to that. Apologies from people like Claire Vaughn weren't supposed to be real. They were supposed to be corporate, calculated, meaningless. But she was looking at him with those sharp, dark eyes, and she looked like she meant it. "Okay," Ethan said finally. "Apology noted." "But not accepted?" "I didn't say that." Claire almost smiled, just a twitch at the corner of her mouth, gone as fast as it appeared. Then she winced and touched her head again. "Concussion?" Ethan asked. "Probably. Everything's fuzzy and it hurts." "Yeah, well, you were dead for about 6 minutes. Your brain's still rebooting." That got a real reaction. Her eyes widened. "Dead?" "Your heart stopped. I had to do CPR." Claire stared at him. "You brought me back." "I guess. For 6 minutes. Give or take." She lay there processing this, her hand still on her head. When she spoke again, her voice was strange, quiet, wondering. "I don't remember any of it. The crash, being pulled out, dying. None of it. It's just blank." "That's probably for the best." "Is it?" She looked at him again. "I died, Ethan Cole, and you brought me back. That's not nothing." "I did what anyone would do." "No," Claire said firmly. "You didn't. Most people would have kept driving. Most people wouldn't have risked their own life, their own daughter's father, for a stranger. Especially not a stranger who tried to destroy their livelihood." Ethan didn't have a response to that. The wind howled, the fire crackled, and in the small cabin, 2 people who should have been enemies sat in silence, alive against all odds, and tried to figure out what the hell happened next. The hours crawled past like wounded animals. Ethan kept feeding the fire, watching the flames consume wood that was running lower with every log he added. Claire drifted in and out of consciousness, her body demanding rest even as her mind seemed to fight against it. Each time she woke, her eyes would find Ethan first, as if needing to confirm he was real, that this nightmare cabin and the storm outside weren't some fever dream her dying brain had conjured. Around what Ethan guessed was 3 in the morning, the temperature inside the cabin began to drop despite the fire. He could feel it, a creeping cold that pressed against his back even as the flames warmed his face. He stood and checked the walls, running his hands along the corners where the logs met. "What are you doing?" Claire's voice came from the cot, clearer now than it had been. "Checking for drafts," Ethan said, not turning around. His fingers found a gap near the window frame where the wind was whistling through. "Cabin's older than I thought. The storm's pulling heat out faster than the fire can make it." "Is that a problem?" "Everything's a problem right now." Ethan grabbed his still damp jacket from where it hung near the fire and stuffed it into the gap. It helped, but not enough. "How are you feeling?" "Like I was in a car accident and died." Claire pushed herself up to sitting, moving slowly, carefully. The blankets fell away from her shoulders, and she shivered immediately. "How much wood do we have left?" Ethan looked at the stack. "Maybe a dozen logs. Enough for a few more hours if we're careful. And then? Then we get creative." Claire pulled the blankets back around herself and watched as Ethan returned to the fire, adding just half a log this time, rationing what they had. The light flickered across his face, casting shadows that made him look older, harder. "You do this a lot?" she asked. "The survival thing?" "I do construction. Sometimes that means working in places where if something goes wrong, you fix it yourself, or you die waiting for help." Ethan poked at the fire, redistributing the coals. "Grew up in these mountains too. My dad made sure I knew how to not die in them." "Smart man." He had his moments. The way Ethan said it, past tense, flat, told Claire everything she needed to know. She filed it away, this small piece of information about the man who'd saved her life. "What about you?" Ethan asked, settling back against the wall. "You grow up learning how to survive blizzards in boardrooms?" Claire's mouth twitched. "Something like that. Denver, private schools, business degree from Stanford, MBA from Wharton. Very traditional path for very untraditional goals." "Taking over mountain towns?" "Developing them," Claire corrected, but there was no heat in it. "That's what I tell myself anyway." Ethan looked at her. In the firelight, Claire Vaughn looked nothing like the polished CEO he'd seen in the local paper, shaking hands with politicians, cutting ribbons on new developments. Her hair was matted with dried blood and sweat. Her expensive clothes were wrinkled and stained. The cut on her forehead had stopped bleeding but looked angry and raw. She looked human. "You don't sound convinced," Ethan said. Claire was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the wind hit the cabin in a gust that made the whole structure groan. She pulled the blankets tighter. "I used to be," she said finally. "Convinced, I mean. That what we were doing, what I was doing, was right. Development, progress, jobs, growth. All the words that make destroying things sound noble. And now? Now I'm sitting in a freezing cabin because I was driving through a blizzard to get to a meeting about acquiring another property. Another piece of land to turn into something profitable." She looked at Ethan. "I don't even remember what the property was. Isn't that awful? I was willing to risk my life to get to a meeting about something I can't even remember." Ethan didn't respond immediately. He just watched her, this woman who'd tried to take his business, his father's legacy, and who now sat wrapped in moth-eaten blankets admitting that maybe she didn't know what the hell she was doing with her life. "Why do you do it then?" he asked. Claire laughed, sharp and bitter. "Because I'm good at it. Because it's all I've ever done. Because when you build something from nothing, when you turn a small firm into an empire, you don't just walk away because you're having doubts." "Your company wasn't always big?" "Vaughn Development was my father's small construction firm when I was growing up. 3 employees, local jobs, honest work." Claire's voice went distant. "He died when I was 23. Heart attack. Left me a business that was barely breaking even and a pile of debt. I spent the next 15 years turning it into what it is now. By crushing companies like mine." "Yes." Claire met his eyes. "By being ruthless. By doing whatever it took to grow. By telling myself that the ends justified the means. Do they? I don't know anymore." The admission hung between them, honest and raw. Ethan felt something shift in his chest, Not forgiveness exactly, but maybe the beginning of understanding. Claire Vaughn wasn't a monster. She was just a person who'd made choices, same as him. Some of those choices had hurt people, but sitting here, stripped of her power and her polish, she at least seemed to know it. Your daughter, Claire said, changing the subject. Sophie. Tell me about her. Ethan's expression softened immediately, the hard edges smoothing out. She's 6, smart as hell, stubborn, gets that from her mother. Where is her mother? Dead, cancer, 3 years ago. Claire's face fell. I'm sorry. Yeah. Ethan stared at the fire. Rebecca she was the good one. Between the two of us, I mean. I was the guy who knew how to build things. She was the one who knew how to build a life, a family. She made everything make sense. What was she like? Ethan smiled, a real smile, sad and warm at the same time. She was a teacher, 4th grade. She used to say that if you could teach 4th graders, you could handle anything life threw at you. She was patient, kind. She saw the best in people even when they didn't deserve it. He paused. She would have stopped for you too, on that highway. She would have insisted on it. And you? Claire asked quietly. Did you want to stop? Or did you do it because that's what she would have done? Ethan thought about it. Really thought about it. Both, I guess. I don't know. When I saw your car, my first instinct was to keep driving. Save myself. Get home to Sophie. That was the smart choice. The logical choice. He rubbed his face with both hands. But then I thought about what Rebecca would say if she knew I'd driven past someone who needed help. And I thought about Sophie learning that her dad was the kind of man who saved himself and left others to die. And I just couldn't. Even knowing what I know about you, about your company, I couldn't live with being that person. So you risked everything. I risked everything, Ethan agreed, and I still don't know if it was brave or stupid. It was both, Claire said. Most brave things are. They sat in silence after that, the weight of confession and revelation settling over them like the snow settling over the cabin. The fire burned lower, the cold pressed closer, and two people who should have hated each other found something else instead, not friendship exactly, but recognition. Two people who'd built walls around themselves, who'd survived by being hard and careful and alone, suddenly forced to be vulnerable. It was terrifying. Around what might have been dawn, impossible to tell with the storm still raging, the shivering started again. Claire tried to hide it at first, pulling the blankets tighter, clenching her jaw to keep her teeth from chattering, but Ethan saw. You're getting cold, he said. I'm fine. You're shaking. The fire's dying and we're almost out of wood. Ethan stood and checked the stack. 8 logs left. Maybe 4 hours if they burned them slow. Your body temperature dropped too far earlier. You're vulnerable to hypothermia now, more than I am. Claire wanted to argue. He could see it in her eyes, but another shiver ran through her and the words died unspoken. She was cold, getting colder. And they both knew what happened if she got too cold again. Ethan looked at the fire, at the dwindling woodpile, at the woman on the cot who was trying very hard to pretend she wasn't in trouble. He did the math. The cabin would be freezing in a few hours. 1 fire, 2 people, not enough fuel. They needed to conserve heat, all of it. We need to share warmth, Ethan said. Claire looked up at him. What? Body heat? It's the most efficient way to stay warm when resources are limited. We put the blankets over both of us, and we use our combined body heat to— I know what sharing body heat means, Claire interrupted. She stopped, and something complicated crossed her face. Embarrassment, maybe, or fear. I don't know you. I saved your life. That doesn't mean I know you. Fine, then freeze. I don't care. Ethan sat back down against the wall, pulling the tarp around himself. But when you start shaking so hard you can't stop, when your lips turn blue again, don't expect me to do CPR twice in one night. I'm tired. It was harsh. Ethan knew it was harsh, but he was exhausted, scared for Sophie, and running out of patience for pride, his or anyone else's. Claire stared at him for a long moment. Then slowly, she shifted on the cot, moving over to make room. Fine, she said quietly. But stay on top of the blankets. That defeats the whole purpose of stay on top of the blankets, Ethan. He sighed, but nodded. He added another log to the fire, half a log really, split down the middle, and then moved to the cot. It was small, meant for one person, and even with Claire pressed against the wall, there was barely room for him to lie down without touching her. Ethan lay down on his side, his back to her, the blankets between them. He pulled the tarp and one of the wool blankets over himself. The cot creaked under their combined weight, but held. For a few minutes, neither of them moved. Ethan could feel Claire's body heat through the layers, could hear her breathing, careful and controlled. His own body was rigid, every muscle tense, acutely aware of how close they were. "This is weird," Claire said. "Yeah. I've never—" She stopped. "I don't usually— I know. Me neither." More silence. The fire crackled. The wind howled, and two strangers lay back to back on a cot barely big enough for one, trying to stay alive. "Can I ask you something?" Claire's voice was quiet, almost lost under the sound of the storm. "Sure. Why construction? You could have sold the business, taken the money, done something easier, especially after your wife died. Why keep fighting for it?" Ethan closed his eyes. The answer was complicated. The answer was simple. Because my dad built that company with his bare hands. Because he taught me that if you're going to make something, you make it right. You make it last. You don't cut corners, and you don't quit when things get hard. He paused. And because after Rebecca died, it was the only thing I had left that made sense. Sophie needed me, but she also needed to see that when life knocks you down, you get back up. You keep building. You don't surrender. Even when it would be easier to surrender? Especially then. Claire was quiet for a while. Then she said, "I think I've been surrendering my whole life, just in the opposite way. I kept building and growing and expanding because if I stopped, if I slowed down, I'd have to look at what I'd actually built, and I wasn't sure I'd like what I saw." "Do you like it?" Ethan asked. "What you've built?" "I don't know. It's successful, it's profitable, it's impressive on paper." Another pause. "But I can't remember the last time I did something that wasn't about the next deal, the next acquisition, the next quarterly report. I can't remember the last time I felt anything." "You feel cold right now." Claire actually laughed, a soft, surprised sound. "Yes, I definitely feel that. It's a start." They fell quiet again, but this time the silence was different, less awkward, almost comfortable. The cold was still pressing in, but it felt more manageable with two of them fighting it together. "Tell me more about Sophie," Claire said eventually. So Ethan did. He told her about how Sophie had Rebecca's smile and his stubborn streak, how she loved dinosaurs and hated broccoli, how she'd started kindergarten the year after Rebecca died and had been so brave, even when she was clearly terrified. How she'd asked him once if Mommy was watching from heaven, and Ethan had said yes even though he didn't know if he believed it, because Sophie needed to believe it. Claire listened without interrupting, and Ethan found himself talking more than he'd talked to anyone in months, maybe years. He told her about the construction business, about jobs that had gone well and jobs that had been disasters, about clients who'd become friends and clients he'd never work for again if they paid him double. And somehow, without Ethan quite noticing how it happened, Claire started talking too, about board meetings that all blurred together, about her apartment in Denver that was more like a hotel room than a home, about realizing at 41 that she didn't have any real friends, just business associates and employees and people who wanted something from her. "I went to college with a woman named Sarah," Claire said at some point, her voice drowsy. The warmth from their shared body heat and the fire was making her sleepy. "We were roommates freshman year, best friends. We were going to change the world together. She wanted to be a teacher. I wanted to build things." "What happened to her?" "We lost touch. I got busy with the company. She got busy with her life. Last I heard, she was teaching in Portland. Married, 2 kids. Claire's voice went soft. "I got a wedding invitation from her 10 years ago. I sent a gift but didn't go. Too much work to do. I couldn't afford the time." "Do you regret it?" "I regret all of it. Every choice I made that put work over people. Every time I said yes to a deal and no to everything else." She shifted slightly. "Do you ever regret stopping? For me?" Ethan thought about Sophie, alone and worried, about his truck buried in snow, about everything that stopping had cost him. "Ask me again when we're out of here," he said. "Fair enough." The cabin grew colder. Ethan added another log to the fire. They were down to 6 now. The wind seemed to be getting worse, slamming against the walls with enough force to make the whole structure shake. Snow was starting to drift in through the gap under the door, piling up in a small white ridge that crept further into the room with each gust. "Ethan?" Claire's voice was barely above a whisper. "Yeah?" "I'm still cold." He could feel her shivering now, tremors running through her body despite the blankets, despite the fire, despite everything. Her core temperature was still too low. She needed more warmth. "Okay," Ethan said. "Okay, just hold on." He got up and added 2 more logs to the fire, half the remaining supply, but they needed it now. The flames jumped higher, throwing more heat. Then he went back to the cot and repositioned, lying down next to Claire, but this time without the blankets between them. He wrapped the blankets and tarp around both of them and put his arm around her, pulling her against his chest. She stiffened immediately. "I know," Ethan said quietly, "but you're going into hypothermia again, and I'm not doing CPR twice, so just accept the warmth and stop fighting." Claire was rigid in his arms for maybe 30 seconds. Then, slowly, she relaxed. Her shivering eased, her breathing steadied, and Ethan felt her body heat start to stabilize, her temperature climbing back toward safe. "Thank you," she whispered. "Don't mention it." They lay like that as the fire burned and the storm raged and the night refused to end. Ethan could feel Claire's heartbeat against his chest, steady, alive, a rhythm he'd brought back from nothing. It should have been awkward. It should have been impossible. This woman had tried to destroy his livelihood. He should hate her, but he didn't. Somewhere in the space between dying and surviving, between enemy and stranger, something had shifted. Ethan didn't know what to call it, didn't know if it mattered. All he knew was that Claire Vaughn was human, fragile, scared, same as him. "My father used to say something," Claire said into the darkness. "He said that you don't really know someone until you see them without their armor. Everyone wears armor, business suits, titles, money, power, all the things we use to protect ourselves, but strip it all away and you find out who people really are." Wise man. He was. I spent 15 years ignoring everything he taught me, building armor instead of building anything real. She paused. "I think he'd be ashamed of what I became. Or maybe he'd understand why you did it. Would he? You were trying to protect yourself, trying to make sure you'd never be vulnerable again. That's not shameful. That's human." Claire was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "I don't know how to not be the person I've been. I don't know how to take off the armor." "I don't think you get a choice right now," Ethan said. "The storm took your armor, the crash, being here. You're just Claire. Not the CEO, not the company, just a person trying not to freeze to death. Is that a good thing?" "I don't know. Ask me when we're out of here." She almost laughed. "You keep saying that." "Because I keep meaning it." More time passed. The fire burned lower again. Ethan would need to add more wood soon, but he didn't want to move. Claire had finally stopped shivering. Her breathing had evened out into something close to sleep. Moving would wake her, and she needed rest more than he needed to feed the fire right this second. So he stayed still and listened to the storm and thought about Sophie and Rebecca and choices and survival and all the ways life could break you if you let it. "Ethan?" Claire's voice was drowsy, half asleep. "Yeah? If we die in here, I want you to know that I'm sorry for everything my company did to yours, for being the kind of person who would do that. I'm sorry. We're not going to die in here. But if we do, we're not," Ethan said firmly. "I didn't drag you through a blizzard and bring you back from death just to freeze to death in a cabin. We're surviving this, both of us. And when we get out, you're going to make different choices, better ones. And I'm going to go home to my daughter and never, ever stop for anyone in a snowstorm again." Claire's laugh was soft, almost silent. "Liar." "Yeah," Ethan admitted. "Probably." She fell asleep after that, her body going slack against his, her breathing deep and even. Ethan stayed awake, watching the fire, counting the remaining logs. 4, maybe 3 hours. The storm had to break eventually. It had to. When the fire burned down to coals, Ethan carefully extracted himself from the blankets and added the last 3 logs. The flames fought back to life, reluctant but determined. He checked the gaps in the walls, stuffing his flannel shirt into a crack that had started leaking cold air. Then he checked Claire, pulse strong, skin warm, sleeping deeply. She'd survive the night. They both would. Ethan returned to the cot and pulled Claire back against him, wrapping the blankets around them both. She murmured something in her sleep but didn't wake. Outside, the wind finally started to ease, the howling dropping to a steady moan. The storm was breaking. Dawn was coming. And with it, whatever came next. The light came slowly, gray and hesitant, bleeding through the cabin's single window, like something that wasn't sure it was welcome. Ethan woke to silence. Real silence. Not just the absence of sound, but the presence of stillness. The wind had stopped. The storm had finally exhausted itself. He lay there for a moment, disoriented, his body stiff from the awkward position on the cot. Claire was still pressed against him, her breathing soft and regular. The fire had died to embers that gave off almost no heat. The cabin was cold enough that he could see his breath, but it wasn't the killing cold of the night before. It was survivable. Carefully, Ethan extracted himself from the blankets and stood. His legs protested, muscles screaming from yesterday's exertion, and a night spent barely moving. He stumbled to the window and looked out. The world had been erased. Everything was white. The trees, the ground, the distant shapes that might have been his truck, or might have been boulders. The snow had to be 3 feet deep, maybe more in the drifts. The sky was still gray, pregnant with the threat of more weather, but for now it was calm. "Is it over?" Claire's voice came from behind him, rough with sleep. Ethan turned. She was sitting up, the blankets pooled around her waist, her hair a wild tangle. The cut on her forehead looked better in the daylight, ugly but not infected. She looked exhausted and fragile and somehow more real than any version of Claire Vaughn he could have imagined. "The storm? Yeah, for now." He moved to the fireplace and stirred the embers, but there was nothing left to burn. The last of the wood had given everything it had. "We need to get out of here, get you to a hospital." "Can we walk out?" Ethan thought about the 3 feet of powder, the distance to the nearest road, Claire's injuries, his own exhaustion. "Not easily, but if we follow the tree line back to where my truck is, we might be able to flag down help. Highway patrol will be out clearing the roads." Claire nodded and started to stand, then sat back down abruptly, her hand going to her head. "Dizzy." "Concussion," Ethan reminded her. "You need to move slow." "I need to move, period. Sitting here isn't helping anyone." She was right, but that didn't make it easier. Ethan helped her to her feet, steadying her when she swayed. Her expensive boots were still damp from yesterday, her coat was somewhere by the fire, and she looked in no shape to trek through waist-deep snow. But they didn't have a choice. Ethan retrieved her coat and helped her into it, his fingers fumbling with the buttons. Claire watched him work, something unreadable in her expression. "You know," she said quietly, "yesterday morning I woke up in a hotel room in Creed, and the biggest problem I had was whether to have the continental breakfast or skip it for the meeting. Now I'm standing in a freezing cabin being dressed by a man I tried to bankrupt, and somehow this feels more real than anything I've done in years. Dying tends to give you perspective." "Is that what this is? Perspective?" "I don't know what else to call it." Claire was quiet as Ethan finished with her coat and then pulled on his own jacket, still damp and cold, but better than nothing. He wrapped the emergency blanket around her shoulders like a cape, tucking it into her coat to hold it in place. "When we get out of here," Claire said, "when this is over and I'm back in Denver and you're back with Sophie, what happens then?" Ethan paused, his hands still on the blanket. "What do you mean? Do we pretend this didn't happen? Do we go back to being strangers? Enemies?" She looked at him. Or did something change? Ethan met her eyes and saw the question there, the vulnerability. He thought about the night they'd spent pressed together, sharing warmth and confessions. He thought about her apology, about the way she'd looked when she'd admitted she didn't know how to take off her armor. "I don't know," he said honestly. "I guess we'll find out." It wasn't the answer Claire wanted. He could see that in the way her expression closed off slightly, the walls trying to rebuild themselves. But it was the only answer Ethan had. They'd survived a night. That didn't mean they'd survive whatever came after. They left the cabin together, stepping out into a world transformed. The cold hit immediately, sharp and clean, but without the wind it was bearable. Ethan pulled the door closed behind them, some ingrained instinct to leave things as he'd found them, and then he took Claire's arm to steady her as they navigated the porch steps. The snow was deep, deeper than Ethan had thought. Each step required lifting his leg high, pushing through powder that came up to his thighs. Claire struggled worse, her shorter frame and her injuries making every movement exhausting. They'd gone maybe 50 feet when she had to stop, breathing hard, her face pale. "I can't," she gasped. "Ethan, I can't do this." "Yes, you can." "I'm slowing you down. You should go without me. Get help and come back." "Not happening." "I'm serious." "So am I." Ethan positioned himself in front of her. "Get on my back." "What?" "Piggyback. I'll carry you. We'll move faster." "You can't carry me through this. You'll collapse." "Maybe. But we'll get further than we will with you trying to walk." He looked over his shoulder at her. "Trust me." Claire stared at him for a long moment. Then, slowly, she wrapped her arms around his neck and let him hoist her onto his back. She was lighter than he'd expected, all that expensive thinness translating to barely any weight. Ethan adjusted his grip under her thighs and started walking. It was brutal. Every step was a fight against the snow, against gravity, against his own exhausted muscles. But it was faster than waiting for Claire to struggle through on her own. Ethan followed the tree line, using the trunks as landmarks, heading toward where he thought his truck should be. "Thank you," Claire said quietly, her breath warm against his ear. "Save it for when we're not dying." "We're not dying." "Not yet." She almost laughed, and Ethan felt the vibration of it against his back. They moved in silence after that, Ethan focusing everything he had on putting one foot in front of the other. His thighs burned, his back screamed, his lungs felt like they were filled with ice. But he kept moving. It took 20 minutes to cover what should have been a 5-minute walk. When Ethan finally saw the shape of his truck through the trees, half buried in a drift, he could have cried with relief. He let Claire down carefully, both of them stumbling, and they leaned against each other for a moment, just breathing. "Now what?" Claire asked. "Now we wait by the road, flag down the first vehicle we see." They made their way to the highway, or where the highway should have been. It was impossible to tell where the road ended and the shoulder began. Everything was just white. But Ethan could see the guardrail poking up through the snow in places, and he used that to orient them. They didn't have to wait long. The sound came first, the rumble of a heavy engine, the grinding of chains on tires. Then, through the gray morning light, a shape appeared, a rescue vehicle, one of the county's big plows with search and rescue painted on the side. Ethan stepped into what he hoped was the middle of the road and waved both arms over his head. The truck slowed, stopped. A door opened and a man in a heavy orange parka jumped down, his face hidden behind a ski mask and goggles. When he pulled the mask down, Ethan recognized him, Tom Rodriguez, a paramedic who'd done some work on Ethan's crew a few years back. "Jesus Christ, Cole?" Tom stared at them like they were ghosts. "We've been looking for you since midnight. Your neighbor called in that you never came home, and you—" He looked at Claire. "You're the woman from the SUV, Claire Vaughn. Your assistant reported you missing yesterday afternoon." "We were in a cabin," Ethan said, his voice coming out rough. "Storm trapped us. You look like hell, both of you." Tom was already moving, gesturing to the rescue truck. "We need to get you to the hospital, now. Can you walk?" "She's concussed. Hypothermia last night. I'm just tired." "Just tired," Tom repeated, shaking his head. "You're half frozen, and you look like you went 10 rounds with the mountain. Come on." He helped them to the truck, supporting Claire when her legs threatened to give out. Inside, the cab was gloriously warm, the heater blasting. Another rescue worker, a woman Ethan didn't recognize, was already on the radio calling in their location and status. Tom wrapped them both in thermal blankets and checked Claire's vitals, his hands quick and professional. "Pulse is strong. Breathing's good. How's your head?" "Hurts," Claire admitted. "Scale of 1 to 10? 7, maybe 8. And you? Tom looked at Ethan. I'm fine. That's what everyone says right before they collapse. When did you last eat? Ethan had to think about it. Yesterday afternoon, the day before? Time had become meaningless. I don't remember. Right. We're getting you both to Southern Colorado Regional. They're expecting casualties from the storm. Tom pulled out a water bottle and handed it to Claire. Small sips. You're probably dehydrated. The drive to the hospital took 40 minutes, the rescue truck moving slow through snow that hadn't been cleared yet. Ethan sat with Claire in the back, both of them wrapped in blankets, both of them silent. The female rescue worker, her name tag said Martinez, kept glancing at them with undisguised curiosity. You two were in the Keller cabin? She asked finally. Yeah, Ethan said. All night in that storm? Yeah, Martinez whistled low. That's insane. That storm was Category 5 conditions. Wind chills hit 40 below. You're lucky to be alive. I know, Ethan said quietly, and beside him Claire's hand found his under the blankets and squeezed once. He squeezed back. The hospital was chaos. The storm had caused accidents all over the county, car wrecks, people trapped in their homes without heat, a roof collapse at a senior center. The emergency room was packed with patients and frantic staff. But when Tom walked in with Claire Vaughn, CEO of Vaughn Development, everything shifted. Suddenly there were doctors, nurses, administrators appearing from nowhere. Claire was whisked away immediately, loaded onto a gurney, and rolled through double doors before Ethan could say anything. He stood there in the waiting room, still wrapped in his thermal blanket, watching her disappear. Mr. Cole? A nurse appeared at his elbow. Come with me. We need to examine you. I'm fine. You're not fine. You've been exposed to extreme cold for over 12 hours. We need to check for frostbite, hypothermia, exhaustion. This isn't optional. Ethan let himself be led to an examination room. They took his vitals, his temperature, examined his hands and feet for frostbite. A doctor who looked about 20 years old shined a light in his eyes and asked him questions about his symptoms. Dizzy? No. Nauseous? No. Confused? Only about why everyone was making such a fuss. You're lucky, the young doctor said, making notes on a tablet. Mild dehydration, minor frostbite on 3 fingers, but nothing serious. Extreme exhaustion. You need rest, fluids, and food. We're going to keep you for observation for a few hours. I need to get home. My daughter is fine, the doctor interrupted. We already called your emergency contact. A Mrs. Chen? She's bringing your daughter here. Ethan's chest tightened. Sophie. He was going to see Sophie. They moved him to a private room and hooked him up to an IV for fluids. A nurse brought him warm broth and crackers and stood there until he ate every bite. Then they left him alone, and Ethan lay in the hospital bed and stared at the ceiling and tried to process the last 18 hours of his life. He'd almost died. Claire had died, and he'd brought her back. They'd spent a night pressed together for warmth, sharing confessions like they were friends instead of enemies. And now they were here, in a hospital, about to return to their separate lives. What happened now? The question Claire had asked in the cabin came back to him. Did something change? Or did they go back to being strangers? Ethan didn't have an answer. The door burst open and Sophie ran in, Mrs. Chen hurrying behind her. His daughter launched herself at the bed, climbing up beside him, her small arms wrapping around his neck with enough force to strangle. Daddy! She was crying, her face buried in his shoulder. You didn't come home. You didn't come home, and Mrs. Chen said you were lost in the storm, and I thought, I'm okay, baby. Ethan held her tight, breathing in the familiar smell of her strawberry shampoo, feeling her solid weight against him. I'm okay. I'm right here. You promised you'd come home. I know. I'm sorry. Sophie pulled back and looked at him with Rebecca's eyes, searching his face like she was checking for damage. Did you get hurt? No, just tired. Mrs. Chen said you saved someone, a lady. Ethan glanced at Mrs. Chen, who stood by the door looking apologetic. The older woman shrugged. It's all over the news. Local hero saves CEO. You're famous. I'm not a hero. The news says you are. Ethan groaned. Of course the media had gotten hold of it. Of course this was going to be a story. He could already imagine the headlines, the attention, The way his phone was going to explode with calls once people realized he was awake. Sophie was still watching him, her small hand on his chest like she needed to confirm his heart was still beating. Was she nice? The lady you saved? Ethan thought about Claire's apology, about the way she'd looked when she'd admitted she didn't know how to take off her armor, about her hand finding his in the rescue truck. Yeah, he said quietly. She was nice. Good. Sophie settled against him, her head on his shoulder. Mommy would be proud of you for helping someone. Ethan's throat tightened. He wrapped his arm around his daughter and held her close and didn't trust himself to speak. Mrs. Chen left them alone after a while, promising to come back later. Sophie dozed off against Ethan's chest, exhausted from her own night of worry. Ethan lay there, stroking her hair, feeling the steady rhythm of her breathing. This was what mattered, this small person, this life he was responsible for. Everything else, the business, the money, the pride, it was all secondary to making sure Sophie was okay, that she was safe, that she grew up knowing she was loved. He'd risked all of that to save Claire Vaughn, and he still didn't know if it had been worth it. A nurse came in around noon to check his vitals. How are you feeling? Better. When can I go home? Doctor wants to keep you until evening. Make sure there aren't any delayed complications. She adjusted his IV. There's someone asking to see you, by the way. Ms. Vaughn, should I tell her you're resting? Ethan looked down at Sophie, still sleeping against him. Yeah, tell her I'm resting. The nurse nodded and left, and Ethan told himself it was the right decision. Sophie needed him right now. He needed Sophie. Claire could wait, but he couldn't stop thinking about her, about whether she was okay, about what she was thinking, lying in her own hospital room, processing everything that had happened. Sophie woke up an hour later, hungry and demanding food. Ethan called the nurse, who brought them both lunch, real food, not broth and crackers. They ate together, Sophie chattering about school and her friends and everything that had happened in the 2 days Ethan had been gone. She didn't mention Rebecca, didn't ask about the woman he'd saved. She just needed him to be there, present, listening. So that's what Ethan did. By evening, the doctor cleared him to go home. They gave him prescriptions for pain medication he probably wouldn't take and instructions for wound care for his frostbitten fingers. Mrs. Chen came back to drive them, and they made their way through a hospital that had calmed down considerably since morning. As they walked past the nurse's station, Ethan saw a familiar name on the patient board. Vaughn, C room 347. He hesitated. Go ahead, Mrs. Chen said, reading his mind. I'll take Sophie to the car. You say goodbye. Ethan looked at his daughter. You okay with that, sweetheart? Sophie nodded. Tell the lady thank you for letting you save her. The simple logic of a 6-year-old. Ethan smiled and kissed her forehead. I will. He found room 347 at the end of a long corridor. The door was closed. Ethan stood outside for a moment, his hand on the handle, wondering if this was a mistake. Then he opened the door. Claire was sitting up in bed, a bandage on her forehead, an IV in her arm, looking at her phone. When she saw him, her expression went through several changes too fast for Ethan to track. Surprise, relief, something that might have been hope, then carefully neutral. Hi, she said. Hi. Ethan stepped inside and closed the door. How are you feeling? Concussed, bruised, alive. She set her phone down. You? Same, minus the concussion. Your daughter? She's okay, waiting in the car. Good. Claire looked at him, and the careful neutrality cracked slightly. I wanted to see you. They said you were resting. I was. Sophie needed me. Of course. Claire looked down at her hands. Ethan, She stopped, started again. I've spent all day thinking about what to say to you. Practiced it in my head a dozen times. But now that you're here, I don't know where to start. Start with the truth, Ethan said. Claire looked up at him, and her eyes were bright. The truth is that you saved my life, twice. And in between saving me, you showed me what it looks like when someone has something worth living for. You talked about your daughter, about your wife, about building things that last instead of things that just make money. And I realized that I've spent 15 years building an empire, And I don't have a single person who would do for me what you did. Not because they don't exist, but because I never let anyone get close enough. Ethan didn't know what to say to that. I'm going back to Denver tomorrow, Claire continued. There's a board meeting, decisions to make. But everything feels different now. I can't go back to being who I was before the storm. I don't know how. So don't, Ethan said simply. It's not that easy. Isn't it? You're the CEO. You make the decisions. If you want to change direction, change it. And if the board fights me, then you fight back, or you walk away. But you don't go back to doing things you know are wrong just because it's easier. Claire smiled, sad and small. When did you become so wise? I'm not wise. I'm just a guy who knows what it's like to lose everything that matters. And I'm telling you that your company, your empire, your quarterly reports, none of that matters if you're alone. I know. She wiped at her eyes. I know that now. They sat in silence for a moment, the hospital sounds filtering through the door, voices, beeping machines, wheels on linoleum. What happens now? Claire asked. With us? Ethan thought about it. Really thought about it. I don't know. We're from different worlds, Claire. You have your life in Denver. I have mine here with Sophie. What happened in that cabin? That was survival. This is reality. And in reality, we can't be friends? I didn't say that. Then what are you saying? I'm saying that I don't know what we are, but I know that you're not the person I thought you were, and maybe I'm not the person you thought I was either. And maybe that's enough to start with. Claire nodded slowly. Okay, we start with that. Ethan's phone buzzed in his pocket. Mrs. Chen, probably wondering where he was. He pulled it out and saw the message. Sophie wants to know if you're coming. I have to go, he said. I know. He moved toward the door, then stopped. Claire? Yeah? Make different choices, better ones. Not for me or for anyone else. For you. Because you deserve to be more than just what you've built. Claire's smile was real this time, small but genuine. I'll try. Ethan nodded and left, closing the door softly behind him. He walked through the hospital, out into the cold evening air, and found Mrs. Chen's car in the parking lot. Sophie was in the back seat, her face pressed against the window, watching for him. When she saw him, she waved frantically. Ethan climbed into the car and pulled his daughter close. Mrs. Chen started the engine, and they drove home through streets that had been plowed clear, past houses with lights in the windows, through a town that was putting itself back together after the storm. And Ethan thought about Claire Vaughn lying in that hospital room, trying to figure out how to be someone different. He thought about the choices she'd make, the battles she'd fight. He hoped she'd win, but mostly he held his daughter and was grateful to be alive, to be home, to have another day. The storm was over. What came after? That was still unwritten. The days after the storm moved like something broken, trying to heal. Ethan went back to work, back to the routines that had defined his life for 3 years. He woke up early, made Sophie breakfast, drove her to school, and then headed to whatever job site needed him. The cuts on his fingers scabbed over. The exhaustion faded. His truck was recovered from the highway, towed to a shop where the mechanic looked at him like he'd survived a war. You're lucky this thing didn't blow the engine completely, the mechanic said, wiping his hands on a rag. Cooling system shot. Alternators dead, battery too, and the frame's got stress fractures from when you push through those drifts. Honestly, Cole, you should just scrap it. How much to fix it? Ethan asked. The mechanic sighed and gave him a number that made Ethan's stomach drop, but he agreed anyway because the truck had been his father's, and you didn't give up on things just because they were expensive to save. The story hit the news exactly as hard as Ethan had feared. Local hero saves CEO in blizzard rescue. The headlines were everywhere, newspapers, television, social media. Reporters called his phone until he stopped answering. Someone from a morning show in Denver wanted to interview him. The mayor's office wanted to give him an award. Ethan ignored all of it. He wasn't a hero. He'd just done what anyone should have done, what Rebecca would have done. But the attention brought something else, job offers. 3 new clients reached out in the first week alone, having seen his name in the papers. Then 5 more. Then 10. Suddenly, Cole & Son Construction had more work than Ethan could handle alone. He had to hire 2 guys from the valley just to keep up with demand. Sophie asked about Claire exactly once, 3 days after they'd come home. "Did the lady go back to her house?" she asked over dinner, pushing peas around her plate. "Yeah, sweetheart. She went back to Denver. Is she okay?" "I think so." "Are you going to see her again?" Ethan looked at his daughter, at those serious eyes that saw more than he gave her credit for. "I don't know, maybe." "Okay." Sophie went back to her peas, apparently satisfied with that answer. But Ethan thought about Claire more than he wanted to admit. He wondered how she was doing, whether she'd gone back to being the ruthless CEO or if something had actually changed. He wondered if she thought about the cabin, about the night they'd spent pressed together, about the conversations they'd had when their armor was stripped away. He wondered if any of it had been real. 2 weeks after the storm, a letter arrived at his house. Expensive stationery, the kind that probably cost more per sheet than Ethan's monthly coffee budget. He opened it standing in his kitchen while Sophie did her homework at the table. The handwriting was precise, controlled, but there was something personal about it that made Ethan's chest tighten. "Ethan, I don't know if you're the kind of person who reads letters or if you'll throw this away the moment you see who it's from. I wouldn't blame you if you did, but I wanted you to know that I meant what I said in the hospital. Everything feels different now. I can't go back to the way things were. I've spent the last 2 weeks fighting with my board, arguing for changes they don't want to make. Yesterday, I pulled out of 3 development deals that would have destroyed historic neighborhoods to build luxury condos. The board thinks I've lost my mind. Maybe I have, but I keep thinking about what you said, that none of it matters if you're alone. You were right. I've built an empire and I have no one to share it with. No one who would care if I disappeared tomorrow. I'm trying to change that. I don't know if I'll succeed, but I wanted you to know I'm trying. Thank you for saving my life, not just in the storm, but after it too." Claire Ian. Ethan read the letter 3 times, standing there in his kitchen while dinner cooled on the stove. Sophie looked up from her homework and watched him with knowing eyes. "Is that from the lady?" she asked. "Yeah." "Is she okay?" "I think she's trying to be." Sophie considered this. "You should write her back." "Maybe." "Daddy." Sophie used her serious voice, the one that sounded too old for 6. "When someone says thank you, you're supposed to say you're welcome." Ethan smiled despite himself. "When did you get so smart?" "I've always been smart. You just don't pay attention." That night, after Sophie was in bed, Ethan sat at his kitchen table with a blank piece of paper and tried to figure out what to say. How do you respond to a letter like that? How do you tell someone that you've been thinking about them too, that you wonder if they're okay, that you hope they're winning their battles? In the end, he kept it simple. "Claire, I'm glad you're fighting for what's right. Keep fighting. You're stronger than you think, and you're not alone, not completely. Ethan." He mailed it the next morning and tried not to think about whether she'd write back. She did, 2 weeks later. Another letter, this one longer, talking about the battles she was fighting at Vaughn Development, about board members who wanted her removed, about investors pulling out because they didn't like her new direction, about feeling like she was burning down everything she'd built and not knowing if anything would grow in its place. Ethan wrote back. Short responses, mostly just encouragement, but he wrote back. And somehow, without either of them quite deciding to, they started a correspondence. Letters back and forth, once every week or 2. Claire talked about her struggles with the company. Ethan talked about Sophie, about the construction business, about small things that probably didn't matter to someone like Claire, but that he shared anyway. It was strange, intimate in a way that felt both familiar and terrifying. They were getting to know each other, really know each other, through ink and paper and honesty. 3 months after the storm, Claire's letter was different. "Ethan, I did it. I walked away. The board gave me an ultimatum, return to the old business model or resign. So I resigned. After 15 years of building Vaughn Development into what it is, I signed the papers yesterday and walked out the door. I should feel devastated. I should feel like I've lost everything, but instead I just feel free. I don't know what comes next. I have savings, investments, enough money to be comfortable for a long time, but I don't have a purpose anymore. I don't have a reason to get up in the morning. And that's scarier than any board meeting I ever faced. I know this isn't your problem. I know you have your own life, your own struggles. But I needed to tell someone who might understand why I made this choice. Someone who showed me that there's more to life than quarterly profits and development deals. I'm coming back to the valley next week. There's a property I'm looking at. Not for development, just for myself. A small piece of land near South Fork. I thought maybe I could start over there. Build something different, something that matters. I'd like to see you, if you're willing. No pressure. No expectations. Just coffee and conversation with someone who knows what it's like to choose the hard right over the easy wrong. Claire Ethan read the letter sitting in his truck during his lunch break. Construction dust on his hands, the radio playing low. He read it twice, then pulled out his phone and stared at it for a full minute before typing out a response. Coffee sounds good. Let me know when you're in town. He hit send before he could second-guess himself. Claire's response came within an hour. Next Wednesday? The cafe on Main Street? See you there, Ethan typed back. He spent the next week trying not to overthink it. It was just coffee, just a conversation between two people who'd survived something together. It didn't have to mean anything more than that. But when Wednesday came, Ethan found himself changing his shirt 3 times before leaving the house. Mrs. Chen showed up to watch Sophie, took one look at him, and smiled in a way that made him deeply uncomfortable. "You look nice," she said. "It's just coffee." "Mm-hmm. It is." "I didn't say anything." "You're thinking it." Mrs. Chen's smile widened. "Have fun on your not-a-date coffee meeting." Ethan fled before she could say anything else. The cafe on Main Street was one of those places that had been around forever, the kind with mismatched furniture and art from local painters on the walls. Ethan arrived 10 minutes early and immediately regretted it. What was he supposed to do? Sit there and wait? Order first? This wasn't a date, but it felt like one, and he hadn't been on a date since Rebecca was alive. He was still standing awkwardly by the door when Claire walked in. She looked different. Not CEO different. She wasn't wearing a power suit or expensive jewelry. She was dressed in jeans and a simple sweater, her hair pulled back in a ponytail, minimal makeup. She looked younger, more relaxed, more like the person who'd shared confessions with him in a freezing cabin than the woman who'd tried to take his business. When she saw him, her whole face lit up with a smile that made Ethan's chest do something complicated. "Hi," she said. "Hi." They stood there for a moment, neither quite knowing what to do. Then Claire laughed, nervous and genuine, and some of the tension broke. "This is weird, right?" she said. "So weird." "Good. I thought it was just me." She gestured to the counter. "Should we order?" They got coffee, regular black for Ethan, some complicated latte for Claire, and found a table in the back corner away from the handful of other customers. For the first few minutes, they just made small talk. "How was the drive down?" "Fine." "How's Sophie?" "Great." "How's the property search?" "Complicated." Then Claire set down her cup and looked at him directly. "I'm terrified," she said. Ethan blinked. "Of what?" "Everything, starting over, not knowing what I'm doing, being in this town where I tried to destroy businesses like yours, walking away from the only thing I've known for 15 years. She laughed, but there was no humor in it. "I woke up this morning and had a panic attack in my hotel room because I realized I don't have a meeting to go to, no emails to answer, no decisions to make. For the first time in my adult life, I have nothing I have to do." That sounds like freedom. It feels like falling. Ethan understood that. He'd felt it after Rebecca died, that sense of gravity disappearing, of nothing holding you in place anymore. "What do you want to do? If you could do anything?" Claire was quiet for a long moment, her fingers tracing the rim of her cup. "I want to build something that matters. Not condos or resort complexes or things that make money but destroy communities. I want to build something that helps people, that makes the place better, not just different." "Like what?" "I don't know. That's the problem. I've spent so long tearing things down to put up something profitable that I don't know how to build anything else." "So learn," Ethan said simply. "You're smart. You know business. You know construction, at least the money side of it. Use those skills for something good. Is it really that simple?" "Nothing's ever that simple, but it's a place to start." Claire looked at him, and her expression was so open, so vulnerable, that Ethan had to look away. This was the woman from the cabin, the one without armor, and it scared him how much he wanted to see more of her. "I bought the property," Claire said, "the one I mentioned in my letter, 20 acres on the edge of town. It has an old house that needs to be demolished and a barn that might be salvageable. I'm going to live there, figure out what comes next from there." "You're moving here? To South Fork? Is that crazy?" "Probably." "But," Ethan smiled, "but sometimes crazy is the right choice." They talked for 2 hours. About Claire's plans for the property, about Ethan's business finally stabilizing, about Sophie's upcoming birthday. They talked about the storm too, carefully at first, then more openly. About how strange it was to have shared something so intense with someone who was essentially a stranger. "You're not a stranger anymore," Claire said quietly. "No," Ethan agreed. "I guess I'm not." When they finally left the cafe, the sun was starting to set, painting the mountains in shades of orange and gold. They stood in the parking lot, neither quite ready to leave. "Can I ask you something?" Claire said. "Sure." "That night in the cabin, when I asked what happens next, did you mean it, that you didn't know what we were?" Ethan looked at her, at this woman who'd walked away from an empire because of a conversation they'd had while trying not to freeze to death. "I meant it. I still don't know." "But you want to find out?" It was a loaded question, an invitation, a risk. Ethan thought about Rebecca, about the promise he'd made to himself after she died that he'd focus on Sophie, that he wouldn't let anyone else into their lives who might leave them broken. He thought about how easy it would be to say no, to keep things simple and safe. Then he thought about the letters, about the way Claire had fought to become someone different, about the smile on her face when she'd walked into the cafe. "Yeah," he said, "I do." Claire's smile could have lit up the whole valley. "Good, because I was hoping you'd say that." Over the next few months, Claire became part of the rhythm of Ethan's life in a way that felt both natural and impossible. She moved into a rental house while the property she'd bought was being cleared and prepped for construction. She hired Ethan to oversee the demolition of the old house and the renovation of the barn, which created the world's most complicated professional relationship. They had coffee once a week, then twice, then Ethan stopped counting. Claire started coming to Sophie's soccer games, sitting in the bleachers with the other parents, cheering when Sophie scored and groaning when the other team did. Sophie adored her, which terrified and delighted Ethan in equal measure. "Claire's nice," Sophie announced one evening over dinner. "She doesn't treat me like a baby." "That's good." "Are you dating her?" Ethan nearly choked on his water. "What?" "No, we're just friends." "Megan's mom says you're dating." "Megan's mom needs to mind her own business." Sophie gave him a look that was pure Rebecca, skeptical and knowing. "If you were dating her, that would be okay. I like her." "Good to know." "I'm just saying." "You're 6. You shouldn't be saying anything about dating." Sophie shrugged and went back to her chicken nuggets, apparently satisfied that she'd made her point. But the conversation stuck with Ethan, especially because Sophie was right. He and Claire weren't dating, but they weren't just friends either. They were something in between, something undefined and complicated and terrifying. 6 months after the storm, Claire pitched him an idea. They were at her property, watching the construction crew clear the last of the old house's foundation. The barn was nearly finished. Ethan's team had done good work, turning the dilapidated structure into something beautiful and functional. "I've been thinking," Claire said, her arms crossed against the evening chill, "about what I want to build here. Not just for me, but for the community." "Okay? What if we partnered? You and me, Cole and Son, and whatever I'm calling my new venture. We could focus on community development, affordable housing, renovating historic buildings, projects that help people instead of displacing them." Ethan looked at her. "You want to go into business with me?" "I want to build something that matters. And I can't do it alone. I need someone who knows this community, who has credibility here. Someone who won't let me slip back into old habits." "Claire, I know it's a big ask. I know I'm the last person you should trust with something like this. But I'm not that person anymore. The woman who tried to take your business? She's gone. I'm someone different now, someone better, I hope. And I want to prove it." Ethan stood there, looking at the barn they'd rebuilt together, at the land Claire had bought because she wanted a fresh start, at the woman who'd walked away from everything to become someone worth knowing. "Okay," he said. Claire's eyes went wide. "Okay? Just like that?" "Just like that. But we do it right. Legal contracts, clear boundaries, equal partnership, and if at any point you start acting like the old Claire Vaughn, I'm out." "Deal." Claire stuck out her hand. Ethan shook it, and when their hands touched, something shifted. A beginning, a choice, a risk worth taking. They called the new venture South Fork Community Development. The first project was converting an abandoned textile mill into affordable apartments for seniors. Then they renovated a row of historic buildings on Main Street, turning them into small business spaces with rent controlled for local entrepreneurs. Then they built a community center on land the county donated, complete with after-school programs and a commercial kitchen. Every project was a fight: permits, funding, community resistance, unexpected problems. But they fought together, Claire's business savvy combining with Ethan's practical know-how to create something neither could have built alone. Sophie watched it all happen, her 6-year-old wisdom seeing things the adults tried to hide. She saw the way her dad smiled more, the way he laughed when Claire made terrible jokes, the way Claire looked at him when she thought no one was watching. 1 year after the storm, almost to the day, Sophie asked the question Ethan had been dreading. "Do you love Claire?" They were in the truck, driving home from school. Ethan's hands tightened on the steering wheel. "That's a big question, sweetheart. But do you?" Ethan thought about it, really thought about it, about the way his chest felt lighter when Claire was around, about how he looked forward to their morning coffee meetings, about how she'd become the person he wanted to tell when something good happened or when something went wrong. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I think I do." "Does she love you?" "I don't know. Maybe." "You should ask her." "It's not that simple." "Why not?" Ethan didn't have a good answer for that. Fear, maybe. The worry that if he named what they were, if he made it real, he might lose it. He'd lost Rebecca. He'd learned that loving someone meant risking the kind of pain that could break you, but he'd also learned, in a cabin during a blizzard, that some risks were worth taking. That evening, after Sophie was in bed, Ethan called Claire. "Hey," she answered, and he could hear the smile in her voice. "What's up? Can you come over?" "Now?" "Yeah, if you're not busy." "I'm never too busy for you. Be there in 15. She arrived in 12, knocking softly so she wouldn't wake Sophie. Ethan let her in, his heart pounding like he was 16 instead of 38. They stood in his living room, the same room where he'd read her first letter, where he'd made the choice to write back. "What's wrong?" Claire asked, concern creasing her forehead. "Nothing's wrong. Ethan took a breath. "Sophie asked me today if I love you." Claire went very still. "Oh." And I told her the truth. That I do. The silence stretched between them, heavy with possibility and fear and hope. "Ethan, you don't have to say anything," he interrupted. "I just needed you to know. We've been dancing around this for a year, and I'm tired of pretending it's just a partnership or friendship or whatever we've been calling it. I love you. I think I've loved you since the cabin, when you told me you didn't know how to take off your armor. And I know it's complicated, and we have Sophie to think about, and the business, and 1,000 reasons why this might be a terrible idea, but Claire kissed him. It was sudden and certain and perfect. Her hands on his face, his arms wrapping around her waist, a year of tension and longing and carefully maintained distance collapsing in an instant. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Claire was smiling. "I love you too," she said. "I've been terrified to say it. Terrified that you didn't feel the same way, that I'd ruin what we've built, that I'd lose you. But I love you, Ethan Cole. You saved my life, and then you showed me how to live it." Ethan kissed her again, slower this time, taking his time, memorizing the moment. When they broke apart, he rested his forehead against hers. "So what now?" he asked. "Now we stop pretending. Now we build this together too." Claire smiled. All of it. The business. A life. A future. "You sure?" "I've never been more sure of anything." From upstairs came a small voice, sleep rough but satisfied. Finally. Ethan and Claire both looked up. Sophie was standing at the top of the stairs in her pajamas, grinning like she'd won the lottery. "Sophie, what are you doing up?" "Waiting for you two to figure it out." She came down the stairs and wrapped her arms around both of them. "Can Claire stay for breakfast?" Ethan looked at Claire, who was laughing, her eyes bright with tears. "Yeah, sweetheart," he said. "Claire can stay for breakfast. And for everything after that, too." Claire did stay for breakfast. And for the breakfast after that. And the one after that. The transition from partnership to family happened so gradually that Ethan couldn't pinpoint exactly when it became official, when Claire's toothbrush appeared in the bathroom, or when Sophie stopped asking if Claire was coming over and started assuming she would be. 3 months after that night in his living room, Claire moved in. Not immediately, not recklessly, but after careful conversations with Sophie, after family dinners and movie nights, and slowly building something that felt solid. The rental house lease ended, and instead of renewing, Claire brought her boxes to the small house Ethan had shared with Rebecca, the house where he'd raised Sophie alone for 3 years. "Are you sure about this?" Claire asked the night before the move, the two of them sitting on her empty living room floor surrounded by packing tape and markers. "This house? It was yours and Rebecca's, your family's. I don't want to intrude on that." Ethan took her hand, threading his fingers through hers. "Rebecca would have liked you. She would have liked what you've become, what we're building together." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "She was my first love. She gave me Sophie. She made me who I am, and I'll never forget that. But she's gone, Claire. And you're here. And I think she'd want me to be happy, to let someone in again." Claire's eyes were bright with tears. "I'll never try to replace her." "I know, you're not replacing anyone. You're the next chapter. And Sophie needs to see that it's okay to love again after loss. That opening your heart doesn't mean forgetting the people who came before." The next day, they moved Claire's things in together, all three of them working side by side. Sophie claimed ownership of helping decorate, insisting that Claire's fancy art pieces needed to be mixed in with our family stuff. "So it looks like we all live here." The result was beautifully chaotic. Expensive paintings next to Sophie's crayon drawings, Claire's designer furniture alongside Ethan's worn but comfortable pieces. It looked like a home. A real one. Built from pieces of different lives that somehow fit together. South Fork Community Development grew faster than either of them had anticipated. What started as a small partnership became something bigger, something that mattered. They hired a staff of 6, then 12, then 20. They took on projects across the valley, affordable housing developments, historic preservation, community spaces that brought people together instead of driving them apart. The textile mill conversion won an award from the State Historical Society. The Main Street renovation was featured in a magazine about sustainable development. A documentary crew from Denver spent a week filming their work, fascinated by the story of a ruthless CEO who'd walked away from her empire to build something better with the man who'd saved her life. Ethan hated the attention, but Claire handled it with grace, using every interview and article to talk about the importance of community-focused development, of choosing people over profits. "You're good at this," Ethan told her one evening after she'd finished a phone interview with a national business podcast. They were in the office they'd set up in Claire's barn, the space now converted into South Fork Community Development's headquarters. "Good at talking?" Claire asked, filing away notes. "Good at using your platform, using what you learned as CEO to actually make a difference now." Claire looked up at him, and the smile she gave him was soft, genuine. "I had a good teacher, someone who showed me that you can be successful without destroying people in the process. I just build things. No, you build community. There's a difference." Their biggest project came 2 years after they'd started the partnership. The county approached them about developing a 100-acre parcel on the outskirts of South Fork. The previous owner had wanted to sell to a resort developer, but the community had fought it, not wanting another luxury complex that locals couldn't afford. "We want housing that working families can actually buy," the county commissioner told them in the meeting. "Not rentals, not condos for rich people from Denver. Real homes for teachers and construction workers and nurses. Can you do that?" Ethan and Claire looked at each other across the conference table. It was exactly the kind of project they dreamed about. It was also massive, complicated, and risky. If they failed, it could sink the whole company. Yes, Claire said, we can do that. They spent 6 months on the design, working with architects and community members to create a neighborhood that felt like it belonged in South Fork. Modest houses with big yards, a community garden, a playground, streets designed for people, not just cars. Every detail mattered because every detail sent a message about what they valued. The financing was brutal. Traditional banks didn't want to touch a project with profit margins so thin. Claire had to call in favors, leverage her reputation, convince investors that return on investment wasn't just about money, but about impact. Ethan worked 18-hour days, managing the construction while Claire handled the business side. Sophie, now 8 years old, became their unofficial quality control inspector. She'd visit the site with Ethan on weekends, walking through framed houses and giving her opinions on whether the bedrooms were big enough for kids' stuff and if the kitchens had enough counter space for baking. "This one's good," she declared, standing in what would become the living room of house number 12. "A family would be happy here." "How do you know?" Ethan asked, smiling at his daughter's certainty. "Because it feels right, like ours does. Like you built it for people, not for money." Claire, standing in the doorway, caught Ethan's eye. That's what they were building. Not just houses, but homes. Not just a neighborhood, but a community. The first families moved in on a Saturday in late spring. 20 houses completed, 30 more under construction. Ethan and Claire stood at the edge of the development and watched children run across yards, watched parents unload moving trucks, watched the beginning of something they'd created together. "We did it," Claire said quietly, her hand finding Ethan's. "You sound surprised." "I am. A little. 2 years ago, I didn't think I was capable of building anything that didn't hurt someone. And now?" Claire looked at him, and her eyes were clear, certain. "Now I know that the best things we build are the ones we build together." That night, they celebrated with Sophie at their favorite restaurant in town, a family dinner that felt both ordinary and miraculous. Ordinary because they'd done it 100 times before. Miraculous because 3 years ago, Ethan had been a widowed single father barely holding his business together. And Claire had been a CEO driving through a blizzard to a meeting she couldn't even remember. "Can I ask you something?" Sophie said, dragging a French fry through ketchup, with the serious concentration only a child could muster. "Always," Ethan said. "Are you going to marry Claire?" Ethan nearly choked on his water. Claire went very still, her fork halfway to her mouth. "Sophie," because Megan's parents got married and Megan got to be the flower girl, and it was really cool. And I think if you married Claire, I could be the flower girl. And also, I want Claire to be official family. Not just living with us family, but actual family. Ethan looked at Claire, whose face had gone through about 6 different expressions in as many seconds. She set down her fork carefully. "That's a very good question, Sophie," Claire said, her voice only slightly strangled. "And one that your dad and I should probably talk about in private first. But you want to marry him, right?" "Sophie," Ethan said, "that's enough." "I'm just asking." "I know, but some conversations grown-ups need to have alone first." Sophie sighed dramatically, like she was bearing the weight of the world. "Fine, but for the record, I vote yes." "Noted," Ethan said, while Claire tried very hard not to laugh. They didn't talk about it that night, both of them carefully dancing around the elephant Sophie had dragged into the room. But it sat between them, this question that had been building for months, maybe longer. They were partners in every way that mattered. They'd built a business together, a home, a life. The only thing they hadn't made official was the commitment. A week later, Ethan called Mrs. Chen and asked if she could watch Sophie for an evening. He told Claire he needed her to come look at a property with him, that there was a potential project he wanted her opinion on. It wasn't entirely a lie. There was a property, but it wasn't for business. He drove them up into the mountains as the sun started to set, following roads that Claire recognized. She didn't say anything, but he could see the realization dawning on her face as they got closer to their destination. The Keller cabin stood exactly as they'd left it 3 years ago. The county owned it now, had fixed the door that Ethan had kicked in, but otherwise it was unchanged. The same small structure, the same stone fireplace, the same place where 2 strangers had survived a night that should have killed them. Ethan parked the truck and looked at Claire. "I bought it, the cabin. The county put it up for auction last month, and I bought it. Claire stared at him. Why? Because this is where everything changed, where I met you, where we both became different people. He got out of the truck and came around to her side, opening the door for her. Come on, there's something inside I want to show you. They walked up to the cabin together, their hands linked. The door opened easily now, no kicking required. Inside, Ethan had made changes. The old cot was gone, replaced with actual furniture. The fireplace had been cleaned and restored. There was electricity now, lights that actually worked. But it still felt like the same space, the same sanctuary. And in the middle of the room, there was a fire burning in the fireplace, warmth and light pushing back the evening shadows. Claire turned to him, understanding and hope and fear all mixed together in her expression. Ethan took both her hands in his. 3 years ago, I stopped on a highway in a blizzard because I couldn't live with myself if I didn't. I pulled a stranger out of a wrecked car and brought her here. I thought I was saving her life. I didn't know I was saving my own too. Ethan, let me finish. He squeezed her hands. You changed everything. You showed me that it's possible to build something new after loss, that opening your heart again isn't betraying the people you've loved before. You became Sophie's family and my partner and my best friend. And I know Sophie already asked the question and probably embarrassed us both, but I need to ask it properly. He let go of her hands and reached into his pocket, pulling out a small box. When he opened it, the ring inside caught the firelight. Simple, elegant, perfect. Claire Vaughn, will you marry me? Will you be Sophie's official family and my wife and my partner in everything, not just business? Will you keep building this life with me, choosing the hard right over the easy wrong, making things that matter? Claire was crying now, tears streaming down her face, her hands pressed to her mouth. For a terrible moment, Ethan thought maybe he'd miscalculated. Maybe she wasn't ready. Maybe he'd pushed too hard. Then she was nodding, laughing through the tears. Yes, yes, of course, yes. Ethan slipped the ring onto her finger with shaking hands, and then Claire was kissing him, her arms around his neck, both of them laughing and crying and holding each other in the cabin where everything had started. I love you, Claire whispered against his lips. I love you and Sophie and this life we've built. I love that you bought this cabin. I love that you proposed here. Sophie's going to be insufferable when she finds out she was right. She's 8. She's already insufferable. They both laughed, and Ethan pulled her close, breathing in the familiar scent of her shampoo, feeling her heartbeat against his chest. The same heartbeat he'd brought back to life with 6 minutes of CPR. The same heartbeat that now beat in rhythm with his own. They got married 4 months later in a ceremony that was small and perfect. Sophie was indeed the flower girl, taking her duties so seriously that she practiced walking down the aisle for a week beforehand. The ceremony was held at the community center they'd built, surrounded by the people whose lives they'd touched through their work. Mrs. Chen cried through the whole thing. Half the town showed up. Even Tom Rodriguez, the paramedic who'd found them after the storm, came to wish them well. I knew you two were going to end up together, Tom said at the reception, grinning at Ethan. Nobody survives something like that and doesn't fall in love. Is that a scientific fact? Ethan asked. It is now. Claire wore a simple dress that Sophie had helped pick out. Ethan wore the suit he'd bought for Rebecca's funeral and never thought he'd wear for something happy. When the officiant asked if anyone objected, Sophie loudly announced, "I vote yes," which wasn't the right response but made everyone laugh anyway. They honeymooned in the cabin. 3 days, just the two of them, in the place where everything had changed. They brought real food this time, not just emergency rations. They kept the fire going all night, not because they'd freeze without it, but because they wanted to. They talked about the future, about the projects they wanted to take on, about maybe expanding their family someday. Do you think Sophie would want a sibling? Claire asked, lying with her head on Ethan's chest, watching the firelight dance on the ceiling. I think Sophie would want whatever made us happy, but you should ask her. I will. Claire was quiet for a moment. I never thought I'd have this. A family, a home, someone who loved me for who I actually am, not what I could do for them. Well, you have it now. All of it. I know, and it terrifies me sometimes, how much I could lose. Ethan understood that fear intimately. He'd lost before. He knew how much it could hurt. That's what makes it worth having, If there was no risk, there'd be no meaning. When did you get so wise? I'm not wise. I just died in a cabin with you once, and it gave me perspective. Claire hit him lightly. You didn't die. I died. You saved me. Semantics. They fell asleep wrapped around each other, the fire burning low, the night calm and clear outside. No storm this time, no fear, just warmth and peace, and the certainty that they were exactly where they were supposed to be. The years that followed were full in a way that Ethan had forgotten life could be. South Fork community development continued to grow, taking on bigger projects, making a real impact. They built 3 more affordable housing developments. They renovated a historic hotel that became a training center for hospitality workers. They created a program that taught construction skills to young people who couldn't afford college, giving them a path to good-paying jobs. Claire was asked to speak at conferences, to consult on projects across the state. She always said yes, but she always came home. Home to the small house they'd expanded to fit their growing family. Home to Sophie, who was growing up confident and kind, watching 2 adults who'd chosen each other show her what real partnership looked like. On Sophie's 13th birthday, she asked for something specific. I want to go to the cabin, she said over birthday breakfast. The 3 of us. I want to see where you guys met, where everything started. Ethan and Claire exchanged glances. They'd told Sophie the story, of course, told her about the storm and the rescue and the night that had changed everything, but she'd never asked to see the place before. You sure? Ethan asked. It's not exactly exciting. It's just an old cabin. I know, but it's important. It's where our family started, kind of. I want to see it. So they went. The 3 of them, on a clear summer day when the mountains were green and alive, drove up to the cabin that Ethan had restored over the years. It was nicer now, properly insulated and furnished, a place they could actually use instead of just a memorial to survival. Sophie explored every corner, asking questions. Where did Dad sleep? Where was Mom when her heart stopped? How did you keep warm? Ethan and Claire answered honestly, not hiding the fear or the danger, but not dwelling on it either. Finally, Sophie stood in the middle of the room and looked at them both. Do you think things happen for a reason? She asked. Claire knelt down to Sophie's level. What do you mean? Like, do you think the storm happened so you guys would meet, so we could be a family? Ethan thought about it. About the choices he'd made that night. About what would have happened if he'd kept driving. I don't know if things happen for a reason, but I know we make choices, and those choices matter. I chose to stop. Your mom chose to fight to survive. We both chose to build something together after. So it's not fate. It's choices. Maybe it's both, Claire said. Maybe fate puts us in situations, but we choose what we do with them. Sophie considered this with the seriousness only a 13-year-old could muster. Then she smiled. Well, I'm glad you made the right choices. Because I like our family. Me too, sweetheart, Ethan said, pulling both his girls close. Me too. 5 more years passed. Sophie graduated high school, got accepted to college to study urban planning because she wanted to build communities like her parents did. The day they dropped her off at school, Ethan cried in the truck on the way home, and Claire held his hand and reminded him that they'd raised someone who wanted to make the world better. That was the point. South Fork community development became a model that other towns tried to replicate. Claire wrote a book about ethical development that became required reading in business schools. Ethan was named Businessman of the Year by the state, an award he accepted only because Sophie insisted, and because it came with a scholarship program they could fund. They built a new headquarters, hired a full staff, and started taking on projects beyond Colorado. But they always came home, always kept South Fork as their base. This was where their roots were, where their family was, where everything that mattered lived. On the 20th anniversary of the storm, Ethan and Claire drove up to the cabin one more time, just the 2 of them. Sophie was away at grad school now, building her own life, her own dreams. The cabin looked good. Ethan had maintained it carefully over the years, keeping it as a reminder of where they'd come from. They built a fire in the fireplace, not because they needed to, but because it felt right. 20 years, Claire said, sitting next to Ethan on the couch that had replaced the old cot. Half my life ago, I was dying in a car accident, and you stopped. Best decision I ever made. Even though it almost killed you? Especially because of that. Ethan pulled her close. Everything good in my life for the last 20 years started with that choice. Sophie got a mother figure. I got a partner. We built something that actually matters. If I could go back, knowing everything I know now, I'd make the same choice. Claire was quiet for a long moment, just watching the fire. I used to think success was about how much you could accumulate. Money, power, influence. I built an empire and felt empty. Then I lost everything in one night, and it was the best thing that ever happened to me. Because you almost died? Because I actually started living. She looked at him, and her eyes held 2 decades of love and partnership and choosing each other every day. You gave me that. When you pulled me out of that car, when you brought me back with CPR, when you wrote me back after that first letter, you gave me a life worth living. We gave each other that, Ethan corrected. I was surviving before you, going through the motions. You taught me it was okay to be happy again, to open my heart, to build something new without feeling like I was betraying what I'd lost. They sat together in comfortable silence, the fire crackling, the night peaceful outside. No storm this time, no fear or desperation or near death. Just 2 people who'd found each other in the worst circumstances and built the best life. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you'd kept driving that night? Claire asked. Sometimes, but not often. Ethan kissed the top of her head. I'd rather focus on what did happen, on what we built, on Sophie and the company and this life we chose. That's very wise. I learned from the best, Claire laughed, that warm sound that still made Ethan's chest feel too full. They stayed at the cabin through the night, watching the fire burn down to embers, talking about everything and nothing, about the projects they wanted to take on next, about retirement maybe, someday, about grandchildren if Sophie ever settled down, about all the years still ahead of them. When morning came, gray light filtering through the windows, they stood outside the cabin and looked out at the mountains that had nearly killed them and ended up saving them instead. You know what I realized? Claire said, her hand in Ethan's. The storm didn't just bring us together. It showed us who we could be, who we wanted to be, and we chose to become those people. And we're still choosing every day. Every day, Claire agreed. They got in the truck and drove back down the mountain, back to South Fork, back to the life they'd built from the ashes of who they used to be. The small house was still there, expanded now to fit the family they'd become. The office still hummed with activity, projects in motion, communities being built. That evening, Sophie called from grad school just to check in, to hear their voices. Ethan put her on speaker so they could all talk, the 3 of them, this family that had been assembled from survival and choice and love. After they hung up, Ethan and Claire sat on their porch, watching the sun set over the mountains. The same mountains where a blizzard had raged 20 years ago. The same mountains that had witnessed the beginning of everything. I love you, Claire said. Not for the first time, not for the last time, just because it was true and because she could. I love you too, Ethan replied, pulling her close. And in that moment, sitting on a porch they'd built together, in a town they'd helped transform, surrounded by a community they'd nurtured, with a daughter they'd raised to be kind and brave and good, Ethan realized something fundamental. He'd stopped on that highway because he couldn't live with himself if he didn't. He'd thought he was saving a stranger's life, but really, he'd been saving all their lives. His, Claire's, Sophie's, all the people they'd helped through their work, all the families living in homes they'd built, all the lives they'd touched by choosing compassion over convenience, people over profit, connection over isolation. The storm that should have killed them had given them everything, and they'd chosen every single day since then to be worthy of that gift. To build, to love, to live. Not just to survive, but to truly, fully, beautifully live. And that, Ethan thought as the stars began to appear above the mountains, was worth every risk he'd ever taken.